This is our fifth class on this Maamar, and it's the second class on Shofar. Last week's class explained the relationship between Shofar and Tshuva, and the point of the class was, in other words, the concept of Tshuva that the Maamar explained to us last week was that when somebody's held back, when someone is interfered with by a negative force and he has to overcome it, and he has to compensate for it, it drives him much farther, much faster than he would if he didn't have that obstacle. And the way we explained it in the Shir, and it seems to be the intent of the Alter Rebbe, is that there's two aspects to this concept of tshuva. The first is the very fact that a neshama is beguf, the neshama is in this world as an iyim from Golus, and the realities of Elam Hazeh that interfere with the neshama's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring out an impetus, a thrust of tshuva. And then the second point, of course, was Aveira, sin, which is a golus that we add to the golus kvayacha that the Eibishter imposes upon a neshama by the simple fact that it finds itself in a guf. And here, even more so, the halamis v'esteidim, the obstacles, the blockages interfere, and the person overcomes those blockages and does tshuva. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya in Perik Zayin, that when you do tshuva mi'avar rabbas, deinis nasaleik yezochias hail v'yedei zeh hu ba l'idei avar rabbazu. The aveda is the basis, is the foundation or the source of the extra energy that drives the person in doing tshuva. So here we continue, and we discuss another aspect of shofar as it relates to tshuva. Line 235, class 5, there's another thing that's represented by the shofar, that as the Maamar explained last week, the shofar is the concept of tshuva, because it's called kol pnima. The Rebbe explained to us there's a chitzonius halev and pnimius halev. There's chitzonius hakoil and pnimius hakoil. Chitzonius halev and chitzonius hakol on the level of emotion and voice, which can be tempered with words and with sounds because they're measured. Pnimius halev and pnimius hakol cannot calm down in words and in sentences. They calm down in a raw cry because they're very, very powerful. They're very, very infinite. And that's the concept of tshuva. Says the Rebbe, Eidzes is another thing that's affected through the blowing of the shofar, which brings down a kol pnima, an inner voice, which comes from pnimius halev, which cannot come down into words and into logic and into form, because it's fundamentally higher than that. And this is another thing which tshuva accomplishes and shofar accomplishes, and that is in humamale kol apgamim, it fills in all the blemishes. Shenas, why the avenis, which was achieved, which was created through sin, mishana sha'avar, from the last year. When a person does an aveda, there are a number of aspects that happen when a person does an aveda api kabbalah. One aspect is that you make a pagam, you make a blemish in kedusha, you make a blemish in yourself. A second aspect is that the yizyanikes hachitzainim, that klipa is able to take because of the aveda. And the third aspect is that because of aveda, on certain occasions, the light departs. The light doesn't come down, the light goes away. And it's explained in Chassidus that there's several aspects of tshuva that correspond to the several aspects of aveda and reverse them and correct them. There is even an incredibly deep tshuva that can bring down ha'or shaneh, that the light which completely departed can also be retrieved, but that's a very, very deep level of tshuva. In short, there are a variety of different effects of an aveda, and a variety of different effects of tshuva. Our Maamar does not explore the specific aspects of wrong that an aveda affects. It does not address the specific aspects of tshuva that reverse those specific aspects of aveda. He simply says the basic idea that you create a pagam, you make a blemish, and it needs to be corrected, and tshuva is the power of correction. And the Rebbe says, line 237, hapgamim, the concept of a blemish. Now think of a blemish like a cut in your skin, God forbid, or a hole in the body, that you have a body, and the body is organic, it's living. I mean, you have a hole, chas v'shalom, blood flows, So there's leakage, which is not good for the body. And there's also the aspect that when there's a hole and there's leakage, the life that came from inside the body to out of the body can be adopted by somebody else, which are two different aspects. There's the pagam and the person, there's the unique lachitzonim. So the Rebbe says like this: Hapagam, the blemish, is sheberamach mitzvahs aseh v'shasa mitzvahs leisaseh, reaches the level of the mitzvahs, which is the 248 positive mitzvahs and the 365 negative mitzvahs. Hainu, in other words, the blemish of an aveda only affects the level of bebechinas chokhmah, the level of the neshama called chokhmah, and lower, but not higher. Why? Shemimena nimshechas hateidah kanal, because Torah is rooted in chokhmah, not higher than chokhmah, and therefore vatsham apgim apagam v'chulu. This is where the blemish, where the wound, where the ill effect reaches. Now this is mamish Kabbalah. This is classic Kabbalah. There are so many different insights into mitzvahs, right? There are Musar insights into mitzvahs, there are Kabbalistic insights into mitzvahs, and of course there are Chassidic insights into mitzvahs. This is a classic Kabbalistic insight. If you had to say it in the simplest of words, this is called the Yichudim. In the language of Chassidus, L'Shem Yichud Kodesh B'Riach Shchintei is the concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Maniach Tefillin. You put on tefillin, the Eibishter puts on tefillin, you keep Shabbos, the Eibishter keeps Shabbos, and so on and so forth. And the way it's explained is that there's 248 limbs that correspond to the 248 mitzvahs. There's 365 nerves or veins which correspond to the shmira of the 365 negative commandments. And when a person does a mitzvah, they strengthen the limb in Atzilus. They create a new yichud in that limb in Atzilus, Harchavas HaKeli, in that limb in Atzilus which is associated with that mitzvah. If a person doesn't have Veda, so the chayis of Kedusha, which is protected by the Gidim, is damaged and it spills to Klip. Similarly, if a person has an opportunity to do a mitzvah and skips it, doesn't do a mitzvah, if you're mavatla mitzvah sasei, so chayis does not go to Klipa when you're mavatla mitzvah sasei, but Kedusha becomes weak. And because Kedusha becomes weak, where Kedusha is weak, Klipa can be yonik. So whether you failed to do a mitzvah sasei or you did a mitzvah slei saseh, the weakness that is affected by each of these avedas is Meisav Chayis and Klipa. That's called a pagam, a blemish, a wound, and it needs to be repaired. It needs to be corrected. And that is what an aveda is, and this is where tshuva needs to be. So the Rebbe says the aveda is only on the madrega of Ramach Evidim and Shasakidim, which is Atzilus, in Kabbalistic terms. Higher than Atzilus, where there's no Ramach Evidim, there's no Shasakidim, there's no mitzvahs. It's higher than mitzvahs. And the pagam never touches. And therefore the Rebbe says, since the aveda or the heder kiyama mitzvah reaches only in Atzilus and not higher than Atzilus, Vayidei Shofar, when Yid blows Shofar, Chanin shach orim bechinas ratzon, the alien that it draws down light from the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in other words, from Keser. Shalamayla me chokhmah hanal, which comes higher than chokhmah. Lachein, therefore, humamali kol apgomim, is able to satisfy, to fill, to correct all the blemishes. Shenasu b'chokhmah, which created in chokhmah. And again, there's several aspects. One is you want to stop the flow from kedusha to klipa. Another is you want to take away from klipa what klipa already took from kedusha. And the third, which is very rare, is to bring down the light that the failure during the mitzvah, which affected the neder, the light never came down, should also be retrieved and corrected. So shofar is a koyach of Ein Sof, and because it's higher than the limitations of Atzilus, of Ramach mitzvah seh, Chesam mitzvah leisaseh, it corrects it. It stops the bleeding. It takes back what has been bled, and so forth. And he continues, Umeyer Chodesh, and it brings on an additional light. And Chodesh means new, means a much higher light, which is B'yases Eis V'yaser Az, with more weight and more power. Marshal, for example, Hanosh Nechra V'yavish. You have a river, and it's dried out. Now, why does a river dry out? Because it's run dry at its source, right? Rivers are fed by tributaries, by streams, by necholim, that are all fed by mayonis, by different little fountains that sit, could be hundreds of miles away, tens of miles away, on top of mountains. Each mayon is a trickle, but it's a persistent trickle. It's an incessant, keeps on going and going and going. and it fills little crevices in the earth, and it slowly gathers into a larger and larger body until you have a nahar which runs with incredible force. When a river dries, it means that the sources of water that were feeding the necholim, the tributaries, the streams that are feeding the river have run dry. So the Rebbe says, you go back to the source, you go back to where the water came from in the first place, and you dig deeper to find the fountain at a deeper source. And it satisfies the lack. It actually increases it. When you go to the source and you dig even deeper, you get to a deeper source of the well of Mayim Chayim. So the lack of water is resolved by going to a deeper source. And when you go to a deeper source, first of all, you make up for the water that's been lost, but you add to it and you increase it, because since the water stopped, you're digging even deeper. And that's the concept of tshuva. The shofar digs deeper than the place of the mitzvah saseh and the mitzvah leisa said, that according to this maimed, begin with ishtalshlus, with chachma, with atzilus, with ramach mitzvah saseh, and shasam mitzvah leisa, ramach evidim, and shasam gidim, and you're digging deeper, and from there you're able to correct it. Key, and he explains, everybody knows there are 3 knots. And 3 knots means what? That Yisrael be'erais. A Jew's relationship with the Eibishter is through the Torah. The Torah is the intermediate, is the medium between Jew and God. When the relationship between the Yid and the Eibishter through the Torah is because the Torah in turn is connected to Hashem. Meaning to say that in the standard model, in the Hishtalshelus model, a Yid does not have a direct relationship with the Eibishter. A Yid has a direct relationship with Torah and mitzvahs, and through Torah and mitzvahs, he has a relationship with the Eibishter. Says the Rebbe, V'hainu k'sheshem edarkei Torah v'mitzvahs. This model, which is really the Chassidishe model, where a Yid is connected to the Torah, and the Torah is connected to Hashem, and therefore the entire relationship between the Yid and the Eibishter is through the Torah and through the mitzvahs, is the way it is when a person is makayim mitzvahs. Avolim chas v'sholem poga be'ez mitzvah. A person made a blemish in a particular mitzvah. Harei nechalash hakesher alos. This knot, this bond was weakened. And therefore the Yisrael miskashloim be'eraisa, the idea that our relationship with the Eibishter through the Torah has been diminished, and it breaks down. Because when it came to Torah, there was a pagam. And therefore, so then ein eitza, there was no choice, ki im idei tshuva. There needs to be tshuva, and what's the concept of tshuva? Could leap from the greatest depths of the heart, as the Rebbe is going to point out several times, like digging deeper in the source of a river to find the water. Shaydez and medalik shur, you jump over the shur. Shur means the middle of the road, the shur sadin, the central path, the reasonable path, and you go to an extreme. And you draw from the idea that there's a relationship between Yisrael and Kudsha B'richu, which is not the idea that the Eibishter and Yidden have a relationship that's not connected to the Torah, and he explains it in the language of Kabbalah, Shehu B'china Seivev Kalalmin. This relationship between Yidden and the Eibishter without Torah is called Seivev Kalalmin. Shenikar Kadosh removed is holy and removed, or by Miskashra Iraisa. And normally, Seivev Kalam would be connected to the Torah, She Bechinas Chachma, which is Madrega of Chachma. And in this case, you have to reveal a relationship between Yidden and the Eibishter, which is higher than the connection through the Torah. When the light of Hashem, which is higher than Torah and higher than Yidden, is reinfused into a Torah which has been diminished through Aveda and through Pagam, all of the blemishes, all of the deficiencies, all of the wounds are healed, and the lacks, and that tshuva is effective, not just to reveal a deeper koyach, which is based on the obstacle, but actually corrects the ills that were created by the Aveda as well. Now, just to say something which is not written in the Maimed, but it's quite close to the Pshat, and that is, you all know this. The Rebbe spoke about this so many times, that the Zohar says, the Zohar is presumed to have said, that Klas Kishir Miskashon Dabada, there's 3 knots. What are the 3 knots? The knot between Yidden and the Torah, and the knot between Torah and Hashem. So the question is asked by the Rebbe, if you have 3 things that are tied together, you only have 2 knots, not 3. Yidden and the Torah and Hashem. So the Rebbe explains that it's a circle, like the recycling symbol you see on the boxes, yeah? Yidden are connected to the Torah. The Torah is connected to Hashem, but on the back side, Hashem and Yidden have a direct relationship. which is called in Chassidus Yisrael u'Malka b'Chidai, the relationship between Yisrael and Malka, which has nothing to do with Torah. This is where tshuva comes from. Normally, the relationship is Yisrael Adei when there is an Aveda, you blow shofar, you do tshuva, which doesn't only bring you back in your relationship with the Eibishter after being distanced, but it repairs, it corrects the pagam. You are the perfection and wholeness of all. You satisfy, you fill up all shmohan. Now the word shmohan can be translated in two ways. The first translation of the word shmohan means the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the second translation of the word shmohan is the word shmoma, which means vacancy, which means desolation. And in this case, this is very, very precise. Tshuva is mamale kol shmohan. It fills the kelim that have been emptied, and it fills the shimamein, the desolation, which happened as a consequence of an aved. And this is the second idea of shofar. The first idea of shofar is tshuva. And the second idea of shofar is that the tshuva not only connects the person to Hashem again, and connects the person to Hashem again even more, but it actually corrects the wrongs. And the Rebbe ties it in to the inyan of the Yod Midas Harach. And this is the Pshat, Hashem passes in front of Moshe Rabbeinu's face. Or he passes in front of Moshe Rabbeinu's own face. And Hashem calls out in a way that reveals godliness. Vehayah Bayom. Now you know, we've talked about this many times, that according to Kabbalah Saharizal, as opposed to other shittas, the 13 principles of mercy begin with Kael. There's Yud Gil Midas Harachamim. And of course, Yud Gil Midas Harachamim go on something which is higher than Ishtalshlos in and of itself. And the simplest ways to remember the sheet of Yud Gil Midas Harachamim, according to Kittas Vehayah, remember two rules. Rule number one is that the first of the 13 midas is Kael, and rule number two that the seventh midas is Ve'emes. So you have 6 and Ve'emes is in the center. So it's Kael, Rachum, Chanun, Erech and Apayim are 2, and Rav Chesed is 1, that's 6. Then Ve'emes is the 7th. Then you have Neitzer Chesed is the 8th, Lalofim is the 9th, Neisei Oven is the 10th, Neisei Fesh is the 11th, Neisei Chata is the 12th, and Venake is the 13th. So Vehayah, not in the Shleish Esrei Midas Harachamim, they're even higher. And in Kabbalah, the Shleish Esrei Midas Harachamim go on the dikna, go on the beard, and it says in Kisvei Arizal which part of the beard is connected to which one of the midas. Vehayah is the base up in the cheeks that have no hair, which is like the forehead, which is Chochmas Adam Toyer Panav. This is where the Vehayah is. But he explained there's a very big difference between one cheek and the other cheek, between one Vehayah and the other Vehayah. And this is what he says. Upasik taima begavai. Between two Havayas there's an interruption, there's a psik. Often in Torah you have, or on occasion in Torah you have the same word repeated 2 times in a row. Like Neach, Avram, Yankov, Mesha, Mesha, and Vehayah. So it says in the Zohar, this is brought in the Sfartem and Samach Vav, that all of them have a psik. Between the first Avram and the second one, there's a pause. A psik is a musical note represented by a line in the page. Avraham. Now, in terms of time yakriya, if you have 2 times Avram, the first will be a tipcha and the second will be a mercha, because tipcha is the time mafsik. And the same is true Neach, the same is true Yankov, and the same is true Vehayah. The exception is Moshe is loy posik tama begavayu. The 2 Moshes are not separated by a psik, because Moshe is higher than all the others, and Moshe Rabbeinu reveals from the Moshe Dila Eila into the Moshe Dila Tata without a tzimtzum, as opposed to Avram, where it says in Tezvav and Igeres HaKedesh, which we just learned in Chitas, Vanechi Afa Ve'efer, that there's a separation between Avram and Atzilus and Avram in the lower worlds. But it says Vehayah is also Pasuk Time Begavayu. And the question is why? Vehayah is Atzilus, the second Vehayah is Ein Sof. In other words, Avram is Atzilus and Bia. Yankov is Atzilus and Bia. So there's understood why Pasuk Time Begavayu. But Moshe is Kes and Atzilus lay Pasuk Time Begavayu. So how come over here it's Vehayah is Pasuk Time Begavayu? So in Sfartem and Samach Vav he gives a different explanation. And here he says like this: Ki yesh beis bechinas shemes Havayah. There's 2 inyanim of the Eibishter's name Havayah. Aleph b'ishtalshalos. The first Shem Havayah is that it is in ishtalshalos. Yud b'chochma hey b'bina v'choli. How the 4 letters of Hashem's name. And of course you know that when they're written out, Yud Kei Vav Kei, there are 10 letters, which corresponds to the 10 spheres. So Yud is chochma hey, is bina vav is the 6 midas, and the second hey is malchus. Visham hey mapagama, and the Torah and mitzvahs that we do are laskana raz the shmei vasisam esam atikra esam ela atam mala ani alechem kila atas aso also uni, we make Hashem Havayah. But the Shem Havayah that we create is the Shem Havayah Vishtalshalos. And it's the same Havayah with the Pagam reaches. Just like we create Shem Havayah through Akiyam mitzvahs, we make a Pagam and Shem Havayah by failing to do mitzvahs. Visham Heima Pagam, that's where the blemishes are, Aidei Teiru mitzvahs. So the performance of Teira and mitzvahs. And he continues, like it says in Kisvei Arizal, when a person says Kishma Shalamita, you say in Pagamti Beis Yud, in Pagamti Beis Heit. Alter Rebbe brings it and he gets a tshuva, soft Perek Zayin, to bring out the point that little Avedas are not little, they're actually very big. Because he links Krishma and Tefillah and Tzitzis and Tefillin to Skila Sefer Hereg and Chenek. But I want you to know that what it says here is different than the Hiratz we say in Kishma Shalamita. Kishma Shalamita, Yud Kei Vav Kei Skila Sefer Hereg and Chenek, and corresponds to Krishma and Tefillin and Tzitzis and Tefillah, if I'm not mistaken. Here he says a little bit different. He brings what you have in Igeres HaTshuva Perek Dalet to represent Yud Kei Vav Kei. And he says the following. Ki mitzvahs Kriya Shema, the mitzvah of Krishma, which corresponds to the Yud, what is the nature of the union between a Yid and Havayah Echad? Besides, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's nothing. Everything compared to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is nothing. So the Yud represents Bittul. Like it says in Tanya, and he gets the Tshuva Perek Dalet, it's brought many places in Chassidishe, the Eil and Likutei Torah. We learned that years ago. The letter Yud is Esat, Bittul. There's nothing besides for the Eibishter. Krishma represents the letter Yud. And Pagamti Beis Yud means V'amavatel Zeh. If a person is negligent in declaring Achdas Hashem on the level of the Eis Yud, which is Bittul, Poigem Be'eis Yud, he's, because the blemish in the Eibishter's name in the letter Yud of Shem Havayah, Shu Bechinas Chochma, which in Ishtalshalos is the Madrega of Chochma. In other words, Bechinas Bittul Ke'echma, that the Ke'echma of Elokus is, in its relationship with the world, diminished. He says, so there has to have a bittul to the yayin. And if you don't have a bittul, it's a pagam. So the first of the four oasis of Shem Havayah is Yud. And in Havayah the Yud is bittul. The Havayah the Yud is Ein Eid Mulvade and Kula Mamish Kala Mamish Chashivi. And if we fail to have that bittul, there's a pagam and Yud. Then he continues on line 261. If a person is mevatel the mitzvah of loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's interesting that he calls it a mitzvah. Because even though he's calling it a mitzvah, it's Mechal Hanastaros L'Havayah L'Keinu. It's a mitzvah of Cheves Alavavis, right? This is not a practical mitzvah. This is an emotional mitzvah. It's a mitzvah in the heart, which is why it's connected to the first Hey. Pege Be'ez He calls it the blemish letter. Hey Shu Bechinas Bina Liba. Because Bina is not only the understanding, it's also the heart. Infinite love and finite love and so forth and so on. Like the Rebbe says in the Yossi Tshuva Perek Dalet, and the Rebbe has in Likutei Torah, the difference between the Mashal and the Nimshal, that in the Nimshal, Lamaila, the Hey includes Seichel and Midas, because the Hey includes anything which is B'chal Hanastadas. So if a person fails to be emotionally involved with Hashem, if a person fails to have a spiritual involvement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a Pakam and Ois Hey. If he has a problem with bittul, that's a Pagam and Eis Yud. If he has a problem with his spiritual connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is a Pagam and Eis Hey. And then he continues on line 263, by de bittul Talmud Teira, if there's a deficiency in his learning of Teira. Pege Beis Vav, because there's a blemish in the letter Vav of Shem Havayah, which is the union of Teira. This is how it's explained in the Yossi Tshuva. She'avav hu amshachah kav oroch. The letter Vav is drawing things down because it's a thin, straight line. Meyud shabanesh from the Yud, which is at its head, all the way down, lamata mata kikola teira, the entire teira b'chenes amshachis, it brings down mechach melah from chach melah, from a higher level to a lower level. Ve'hamevatel talmud teira, someone who's not learning teira the way he's supposed to be, and he's causing him for bittul teira, mekatzer amshachis, makes narrower, makes less, makes shorter what's being drawn down through teira, and it's a pagan be'eis vav. It's a blemish. And of course, the meaning of the word blemish is that the Aveda lasts beyond the Maisa Aveda. In other words, you have in Tanya Perek Chafei, this is sort of implicit. That when a person does an Aveda, there's three aspects to the Aveda, Perek Chav Dalet and Chafei. One aspect of the Aveda is the moment of the Aveda. For 1 second, you didn't Aveda. When that second is gone, the Aveda is gone. But that second is a second of Merida, it's a rebellion against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How to get that second back and reverse the Merida is very complicated. The second aspect is the pgam, the blemish, and the blemish lasts, it continues. But the blemish lasts in the kind of way that it can be reversed and corrected, which is the classic concept of tshuva according to Kabbalah. When Kabbalah says that through tshuva, you're not only coming back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's graces, but you're correcting the wrong. This is the second concept, that you're correcting the pagam. And the third aspect, the Alter Rebbe brings in a parenthesis, in Perich Hafei, that there's an aspect of an Aveda, which is Eine Bebechinas Zman V'Shah, El Meisha V'Shalt Alav K'noida, that an Aveda is L'mayla Min Hazman. Why is the Aveda higher than time? Because the Neshama is higher than time. When a person does an Aveda, the Neshama is forced to participate in Aveda, like it says in Perich of Dalet. And the aspect of the Neshama, which is L'mayla Min Hazman, which is Bal Kochach Eina Amen, which is forced to do the Aveda, is doing the Aveda in perpetuity. And of these three things, number one, the moment of performance of the Aveda, which is called Merida Melech Macham Lacham HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Number two, the Pagam the Aveda, which is L'mayla V'gam B'nefesh. And the idea of L'mayla M'Azman, the one that Chassidishe and Kabbalah talk about the most is the middle one, the correction of the Pagam. The second is gone. The L'mayla M'Azman is very complicated. How do you correct something which is higher than time? And you have to do tshuva a lot. It's hard to know exactly. The Rebbe has a footnote about this someplace in Likutei Torah, but I still don't understand it exactly. Of these three things, what's spoken about here, what's spoken about in Tanya, what's spoken about in all the Maimorim, the talk about the idea that tshuva is mamala kol apgamim, is this middle one, that you cause the blemish, a damage, and you repair it through tshuva. And if the damage is in bittul, you make a damage in yud. If the damage is in your spiritual connection to Hashem, you make a damage in hey. And if your damage in your learning Torah, the damage is in vav. And he concludes on line 266, Vayde bittul mitzvahs ma'asyos. If a person is negligent, has a deficiency in the performance of physical behavioral mitzvahs, be'ez hey achreino shal shem havayah, he's caused a blemish and a damage in the lower hey of Hashem's name, which the Hostia can do as it is no. So the Rebbe says, mitzvahs are called mitzvahs havayah, which means to say that the mitzvahs that we perform are in the Esses Sfiris, as they're divided up into four. Yud b'chochma, hey b'bin, vav b'zon, hey achrei b'malchus. Some mitzvahs are in the hey, some mitzvahs are in the yud, some mitzvahs are in the vav, some mitzvahs are in the second hey. And failure to do a mitzvah or doing an aveda creates a pagam, and tshuva corrects it. Says the Rabbi calls the place where mitzvahs and avedas are, and the place where the pagam, by failing to do a mitzvah saseh, or by proactively doing a mitzvah saseh reaches, is in this lower shema avaya, what's called avaya de letato, shubechinas his havos hishtalshos kanal, which is the vehicle through which the Eibusher creates the order of the worlds in a logical way that has a gradual relationship with us. If you do something correct, you bring down an increase. If you do something incorrect, you create obstructions. Aval shema avaya de le'elam, line 270, as opposed to when a person brings down Havaya, which is higher than say the Ishtalshalos, it's also called Havaya. And the very word Havaya means Ishtalshalos. Yud Simtzum, Hey Amshacha, Hey Espashtos, Vav Amshacha, Hey Espashtos sounds like an orderly thing. Al Shem His Havas, because it creates the world, Shemimenu Yizbarach, which comes from the Eibusher. Nevertheless, this Shem Havaya is higher than the Inyan of Mahava. It's in fact higher than the Inyan of Eisius. It represents Ein Seif. Who bechinas gilu yed draws down and reveals a light from above. Shalamayla mishtalshus, which is above ishtalshus, who bechinas ratzon canal comes from the rega of kesen. Shalamayla mayla min hachachma, it's higher and higher even more. From chachma, and therefore, not only does the pagam not affect that madrega of shema vaya, that madrega in the Yiddish and neshama, it doesn't even affect the world. In other words, as far as Shema Avaya Deli'ela is concerned, the Pagam never touched. V'lachein, says the Rebbe, line 270c. Pasuk Taima Begavaya, behold, there's an interruption between one Havaya and the second Havaya. To say the higher Havaya is Ein Seif, the second Havaya is B'dida V'agbola. And the Pagam can happen only in the lower Havaya. And the correction can happen by confusing the higher Havaya with the lower Havaya. Now that we understand the difference between one Havaya and the other Havaya, and we understand the idea that there's a psik between one Havaya and the other Havaya, Inyan vayikra Havayah Havayah. When the Torah says, and the Eibishter calls Havayah Havayah Hainu, which means Yehu Yizbarech Hashem Yizbarech Himself. Keirei Umamshich calls forward and draws down Shem Havayah Rishon Shalamayla Mishtalshus Kanal, the first Shem Havayah, which is hard to say the Ishtalshalos, Lias Mizgal, Leb Havayah Shem Bebchinas Ishtalshalos, that should be revealed in the Havayah which is in Ishtalshalos, Eid is Vekalim, which is like Neshama and Guf. And as you know from the Shiurim, we've had so many times in the past that the concept of Kriya, which is discussed in Tanya, in Perek Lamed Zayin, Ka'odam Akeda Lachaverik, of Akeda Libnei, that when a Yid says, Eish of Teda Shebeksav, is calling the Eibishter by his name, Kol HaTeda Kulish Beisav Shalak Kodesh Baruch Hu. Alachas Kama V'Kama, when you say Havayah, that you call Havayah means you're reaching to Shem Havayah D'Liela, which Ratzon the Elyon exists, which is higher than the place where the Aveda happened. In the first place, to reverse it. Lamal is, I'm on line 279 now, Lamal is Kol HaPagam, and Vachas is to fill in all the blemishes and all the lacks. Shenasu Bey, they have Avedas which are caused through Avedas V'cholu, U'kemevuah L'mayla, like the Rebbe said, like I said earlier, in the beginning of today's Shir, on line 241, B'mashal HaNor Shayavish, about the drying river, Shaydei Shemetziyim, V'chefrim, Mehamayad, you have to dig deeper and remove the obstacles, the stones that are in the well. Mismal HaNor, the river is refilled. You're going deeper. Says the Rebbe on line 282, V'zehu inyan HaTshuva. That's the concept of Shofar and the concept of Tshuva. That's not only you're correcting the person, you're correcting the effect that the person created in the world. Not only correcting the Gavra, that Hashem should forgive him, you're correcting the Cheft and the ill that the person created. Shaydei HaTshuva, when he does Tshuva, which is a cry from the depth of Pnimius, Halev of Pnimius, Hakoil, as we discussed last week, Keidim and Mamshich, we call and draw down the Bechinos Havayah Shalamayla Meseder Ishtalshos Havayah, which is higher than Seder Ishtalshos. Okamechakos, like it says in this Siddur, which we of course read Naser as Yemei Tshuva, Mimamakim Krasich Havayah, that a Yid calls out from the depths of his neshama Havayah, and he reveals not Stamazay Havayah, is Havayah D'Liela, Havayah which is higher than Seder Ishtalshos. And therefore says the Rebbe Amen, we say Yom Midas Arachim Vaser as Yemei Tshuva. The custom is to say that Yom Mitzrachim and says Tshuva. Now, of course, we don't, because we don't say Slichas during Aseret Tshuva. We don't say Slichas during Elul either. We say Slichas only during the Yemei Slichas. But for those people who do, in the Aseret Tshuva, you say Hashem's name, Yom Mitzrachim, over and over again. Because during this period of time, Aseret Tshuva, Nimshach, it draws down. Bechina says Galas Havayah, revelation of Shem Havayah Shalamai, Lamei Ishtalshos, as it is above Ishtalshos. Shobachin is Ratzon Elyon, which is the Keser. Shalamai Lamei Chachma, which is higher than Chachma, and this corrects the wrongs. What's the kayak to blow the shofar and correct the wrong? Says the Rebbe, it's Ayadei HaShofar, because we're blowing a shofar, and what is a shofar? A kel pasha, a simple cry. Shu is galos pnimis halef, that the simple cry reveals the inner heart. Kanal, as we explained last week, the inner heart cannot be put into words. So the shofar is a cry of pnimis halev, and because it's a cry of pnimis halev, it doesn't have that in form and in order, and it has the power to reveal Shem Havayah D'Liela in Shem Havayah D'Latata and to correct the program that a person made. Line 128, V'lachein tzarech liyas ha'shofar dafka shel ayil shel yov, which is why the shofar has to be either from a ram or from a buck, from a gem's buck, from different types of antelope. Aval shel parah pasal, a cow is not kosher. The horn that you use for shofar has to be a permanent growth on the animal. It can't be something which is seasonal, like antlers of deer. And the removal of the horn from the head of the animal is removing something which is actually a part of the animal. So here he says that not only is the horn of a deer not kosher, because a deer has antlers, they don't really have horns. In other words, they're seasonal, they're temporary. But even the horn of a cow, which is very similar to the horn of a ram or the horn of a buck, because it is a permanent horn and it is a part of the animal, is still possible. Why? And I'd like to look up the nigla, I did not, but this is what the Rebbe is saying. Ki pnei sheir mi'asmel. Because even though a cow has permanent horns, but a cow and an ox represents smell, like we know that shade is the left side, Shubachinas Gavuras, which is the aspect of Gavuras. And the Rebbe says, since you belong to Shofar to create great mercies, the animal horn used to evoke those mercies must be an animal that has within its nature a characteristic of Rachmanas. And the Parah doesn't. Shubachin has Pnimius Halev, which is the inner heart of Ratz and the El, in the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give abundantly. The left side, higher than Ishtalshus, is going to be even more critical, not less critical. The right side, higher than Ishtalshus, is going to be more generous. Therefore, you have to use a shofar of a ram. And what do we know about ram? They come from their sheep, and our sheep have Rachmanas. It says in the Pasuk, Yaakov separated the sheep. They have an idea of Rachmanas. And Yaakov separates them because of his kinship with them. Which is the meaning of Yaakov, because as we see physically, the sound, the bleeding sound of a sheep and a goat is one of compassion. It arouses mercies, and therefore the shofar of Rosh Hashanah could be from a keves or from a yod. Therefore, when you blow the horn of the shofar, which is a pnimius halev cry higher than ishtalshalos, you bring down oir to correct the wrong. Also, you bring on the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Eibishter's mercies, which is higher than ishtalshalos. So this is the first part of tonight's shiur, that in addition to the shofar being an act of tshuva which corrects the person, the shofar is an act of tshuva which corrects the actual effect that the Aveda had on the world. We're on line 297, and now the Rebbe adds another idea. In addition to the two ideas of shofar, and the way I'm presenting it is, the first idea of shofar is the correction of the person, that the thing that held you back drives you and motivates you. The second concept of shofar is able to correct the pagamim that were made because the shofar reaches Havai, which is higher than Seder Ishtalshalos. The last point that the Rebbe speaks to is why it has to be a physical shofar. And of course, you know the additional aspect. It's a physical shofar from an animal that's been disconnected from the animal after the animal died. As the Rebbe calls it, it's a deimem tzebetze meach, that you're using the shofar, a tool, and it's not a living tool. In other words, a person could sing, a person can blow into his hand, and he's a living human being. It has to be dafka shofar shel ayel, after it's disconnected, because there's a special emphasis on the idea that the shofar is done dafke on a physical level. This is what the Rebbe now says, Vihine, Hagam, to be sure, she'ikir ha'hamshocha al yedei pnimiyas halev, that the effect of shofar is to call out the inner heart. Tzoak libam, that the heart cries out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu pnimiyas halev, as we discussed last class. And then in addition to that, we say that this is a Shem Havayah de Le'ela, which is added to Shem Havayah de L'tata to be mesakin de pagamim. Im kol zeh, in spite of these two things, who ideatkia b'shofar dafke, it must be blowing a physical horn. First of all, it's not enough to have the meditations of shofar, you have to physically actually blow the shofar. And second of all, it has to be done with an asiyah, with an action that involves, like I said earlier, a relative daimim. So he says 2 points. Point number one, mitam ki asiyah hiliyela. The first reason why you have to blow shofar, because it says in Zohar, it says in Kabbalah, that asiyah reaches the highest thing. A physical action is the lowest madrega, and the physical action reaches the highest levels of Lamayla, on high. That's the first idea. And what's the second idea? That the incredibly deep lights from the Eibishter, which are coming from the Pnimiyas Ratzon Elyon, which is higher than Ishtalshlos, needs to be drawn down, lamata below, lehislabesh begashmi is to come down into the physical thing, and only when it comes down into the physical thing has this completed its journey, so to speak, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. And these are two separate points. Number one, the physical act reaches the highest. And number two, that the godliness and the blessing has to come down all the way till the physicality. And I want to say something which is almost insulting to bring up. It's really petty. But I want to bring it up because it's a good thing to touch on occasion. And it has enough relevance to what we're learning for me to, so to speak, go off on this tangent. You know that there's a lot of people who call themselves smart who are very disturbed by the fact that in Yiddishkeit there's such an orthodoxy, such an emphasis on Maaseh. I remember years ago there was a Goyish radio host, a Goy who was Grada Oyev Yisrael, who read in an Israeli newspaper or in an Israeli paper, which was in English, that in the Israeli zoos on Pesach they gave the monkeys to eat matzah. And he was out of his mind. He was so upset. He thought it was so hyper, it was so extreme. And vas faram shagas. You want to be religious, be religious. We're giving the monkeys matzahs. But why do you have to be so precise? And so many people make this erroneous claim that Judaism is a religion of ritual. It's not true. Judaism is a religion of faith plus ritual. It's a combination. Most religions are only faith. Some religions are only action. Yiddishkeit is a fusion of both. And it bothers so many so-called enlightened people, so many smart people, that we make such a priority out of the preciseness of the action, what they call orthodoxy, doing the mitzvahs precisely. Why does it have to be so perfect, and so on? And of course, the Rebbe spoke about this many times. You know, if a person buys a car, he wants to have the best car. So why, when he buys the mezuzah, it's not allowed to be the best mezuzah? And why, when he buys the matzah, it's not allowed to be the best matzah? And the teretz is, because a nice car, you understand the value. A nice mezuzah, you don't understand the value. A nice matzah, you don't understand the value. So it's not a question of being orthodox. It's a question of valuing a mitzvah. Once you appreciate the value of a mitzvah, just like you want your car to be perfect, you want your mezuzah to be perfect, and your tefillin to be perfect, and your sefer Torah to be perfect, and so forth. But what is taka the answer? Why is Yiddishkeit so orthodox and so into the preciseness of the performance of the mitzvah? And of course the answer is the very reason that it bothers them is the reason it needs to be. What is the reason it bothers an enlightened secular person that Yiddishkeit places so much emphasis on doing an action and doing it precisely? Why does it bother them? Because it's invading your space. Spirituality doesn't bother anybody. Why? It's in your heart, it's in your mind. But when you have to live a certain way, behaviorally, you have to dress a certain kind of clothing, you have to eat a certain kind of food, you have to drink a certain kind of wine, you have to do this on this day, and this on the other day, and this you can't do on this day. It takes over your practical life. And they don't want to give it away to the Eibishter. And that's exactly what the Eibishter wants, that you should give him your physical life. But the operative word here is not give him your physical life. Give him your physical life also. Of course, Yiddishkeit involves ruach, neshama, mayach, leiv, mind, heart, soul. You're giving to Hashem your pnimius. But the only true criteria, the only real measure that one has given his mind and his heart to the Eibishter is if he translates what he's given of his mind and his heart into his actions. Because if you give your mind and your heart, doesn't come down to actions, there's two problems. First of all, you're not really making a sacrifice. And second of all, it's impossible to gauge mind and heart. So in Yiddishkeit, the combination of bringing down from the highest of the high and bringing it down to the lowest of the low isn't only for the sake of the lowest of the low, that the mitzvah reaches the physical level as well. It's the indicator, it's the marker, it's the proof that the highest of the high is really the highest of the high because it's come to the lowest of the low. And this is the second idea. So the first idea of why it's necessary to blow a physical shofar and to blow physical sounds is because asiyah liyela, actions reach the highest levels. And the second, because it brings godliness to the lowest levels. And the Rebbe continues, Kemaime, like it says in the Siddur, Kasveinu b'sefer chayim tevim, write us into the book of good life. Kasveinu b'sefer panos v'chalkol, this is the Avinu Malkeinu, into a panos, a sefer panos. In other words, liyes mezein is gashmim laha'adam, that a person should have physical panosa. And of course the question again becomes, if you're so spiritually devout, if you're so involved, this incredibly profound and deep and meaningful relationship with the Eibishter, why are you thinking about panos? And the answer to this question, of course, is like it says in Sfara, but it gets to Shemone Esrei. Shemone Esrei is the highest moment in the daily meeting between the Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's Atzilus. It's Avda Kamimor. Hashem Sefasai Tiftach. It's the ultimate bittul. It's Yirei Allah. Alla Gute Sachen. And what does it talk about? Das, and Geula, and Tshuva, and Refuah, and Parnasa, physical things. And the question is asked when a Jew is in such a high level, why is he thinking about physical things? And of course the answer is, The whole advantage of a high level is that it comes down to a low thing. The refuah and the parnasa that the Shmeine essay discusses is not only because we need refuah, and because we need parnasa, and because we need the other things that we ask in the brachas of Bakashas Tzlachav, the 13 brachas, between the first 3 brachas and the last 3 brachas of the Shmeine essay brachas, but because when it comes down to the physical level, that's the ultimate sign that it's real spirituality. Real spirituality is so potent that it works not only on a spiritual level, it works on a physical level as well. So when you see a healing in the body of a sick person, when you see an increase in the yield that a field gives, because a person gave more tzedakah and was more particular about mitzvahs and davened HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the ultimate godliness. In other words, when it comes down to the physical level, you know that the person has really reached a meaningful level in spirituality. And the same is true Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The Gemara says that the Chekli Yisrael Hu means Hatifeni Lechem Chuki. There's a number of psukim which indicate that on Rosh Hashanah the mishpat is for Gashmis. The Rebbe is going to bring in a moment the Hagos Maimonides, who says that not only is the mishpat also for Gashmis, but it's be'ikeh for Gashmis, primarily for physical things. And the Rebbe explains why. Because when the godliness is brought to the physical level, that's the ultimate godliness, A, in terms of from where it has come, in terms of its height, and B, to how low it has descended in terms of its low. Shezehu, the only way to bring a blessing down to the physical level is by the mercies coming from higher than Ishtalshlus, as represented by the Shofar, which is Pnimius Halev and Pnimius Hakol, which brings down Havaya Deliela, as we discussed earlier. They're drawn down and manifest so much lower and lower begashmis in the physical level, that you see the effect of the revealing of Hashem's infinite mercies in a physical flow. And if it didn't come out to the physical level, you would say it's not coming from the highest levels of spirituality, of Rachamim. And the same is also true, Gam Kolos Rachamim, mercies in general. Which are drawn down the Rosh Hashanah Lamatei Kadinim to sweeten the judgment. Hainu Gamkein, the point there as well is, Shenim Shacham Lamata, it comes down very low, Al Derech Hanal as described before. Garei, top of line, page 307, line 307, I Keradin Sheb Rosh Hashanah Ala Gufis. The judge with Rosh Hashanah is primarily about bodies. Im Yichyim Yom, as a person can live or die, like it says in the Yonasana Tekef. Hainu Im Tiskayim B'Tia Nefesh B'Guf, if it's going to be sustained and remain, the soul in the body, or God forbid it will depart. Mashenkin din nefesh, as opposed to the judgment of the neshama who achar amitzis, after a person dies, v'chulu. So of course there's several aspects here. Rosh Hashanah is a day of connecting to Hashem. Or as we learned in an earlier class, on this Maimer, it's Binyan HaMalchus, which is the ultimate intimacy between the Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with such a pnimiistic thing. And now we're talking about physicality and life and death. So the classic idea is this is the pnimius of Rosh Hashanah, Malchus, and this is the chitzonius of Rosh Hashanah, Din. But now the Rebbe is saying, no. The ultimate indicator that the Malchus is complete is that you see it in Gashmias as well. The ultimate indicator that the blowing of the Shofar, which has many purposes, has the purpose of tshuva, has the purpose of taking kalap gamim. It also is, as mentioned earlier in this Maimer, like the trumpets which are sounded on the day that a king is crowned, the ultimate indicator, the effectiveness of the Shofar is that you see it in the person's physical health. Masha'enkin din nefashos, the judgment for souls which are not in bodies, is not about bringing something from the highest level to the lowest levels, and it's achar amisa v'chul, it's after a person passes away. And the Rebbe says, it says Negos Maimonides, who's a Rishon, on the Rambam Hilchos Tshuva, the name of the Ramban, she'ein adam nidin b'Rosh Hashanah ela l'nyani elam hazeh v'chuli yayin sham. That our judgment and Rosh Hashanah is about physical things, about worldly things. And when the Alter Rebbe is explaining it here, it's not because as physical creatures this is the most valuable thing to us. It's not because as physical creatures this is what we care about, but because it's about the fusion of Ruchnius, Sheberuchnius, and Gashmius, Shebegashmius. The highest of the high and the lowest of the low. And only when it comes down into a physical thing do you see that the Rachamim is coming from the highest Madrega, and it begins with the physical Shofar that you physically blow to bring down the Rachamim to a physical level. And therefore, the incredible compassions, which come from Avaya Deliel, that sweetened the judgment, these compassions are drawn kol kach lamata, so low, you see them physically. The Alter Rebbe says, on the very first page, that what makes davening special is it makes a change in the physical world. To make a physical change in the physical world has to come from Ein Sof. Which is why in addition to the fact that the cry of the Shofar is a raw cry and a simple cry. Like we explained last year, the idea of kol pnima and pnimis halev, it has to be done through a physical piece of animal. B'shofar gashmi shel kevish v'she'ayil, the physical horn of a sheep or a ram. Ukiyetze and similar. Sheyesh be'irachim, which has the inyan of Rachmanis, as it's been disconnected from the animal, so it's daimim shebetzei meach, and you have to bring the godliness, and this Rachmanis there as well. And through this, meseder kain lamaila, it has the same effect. Lamaila. When you blow the physical shofar, so you're calling the racham to come all the way down. The rachamim are drawn and made physical. That you come down into a physical flow. Which is physical compassion, physical mercy. The flow of physical life. The aspects of life which we have in common with animals, so to speak, are also blessed by the shofar of Anasa Gam Rachamim. It's also achieved by blowing the shofar, the awakening of mercies, the horn of a sheep, which is an animal. So the Alter Rebbe says, using a physical thing to do the physical mitzvah brings the Rachamim all the way down to the physical level. Now line 329, V'zehu, and it goes back to the point he made earlier, when it says, V'yavar avaya aponav v'yikra v'gemer. Hashem passes in front of the face of Moshe Rabbeinu, or he passes his face in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says, Havaya Havaya. Pirush, Shagilu Zehu, that the revelation of the higher Havaya, which is connected to Tkiyah Shofar, is Sha'ovar al Ponav, he goes past his face. Hainu. Shalei Kefi Aroyel is Mebechinas Ponav, that the Eibush that gives Moshe Rabbeinu not just what Moshe is deserving, on a level of Ishtalshus, which is called Ponim, Shu Pnimi is, because Eini Yochel is Labish Kol Kach Lamat, it can't come that low. And here it's Vayavar Avaya Ponav, you go higher than the Bechin of Ponav, and that's how it come down so low. Vaya Machakasabaka Machad, the Ponav Bechin is Spheres. The face, in this case, is the 10 spheres, which I find very interesting and very controversial, but we're going to leave it alone. When you go higher than Ponim, you can come very low. That you're passing from Avaya de Le'ela, which is higher than Ponim, and therefore you come to the physical level as well. That's it. And in Mitzvah Hashem next week, we're going to continue the Maamar. But at this point, we're moving on to the second half of this Maamar. The first half of this Maamar, at least 5 shiurim, in other words, explain the Shofar of Rosh Hashanah. And the rest of the Maamar, which will take us also an additional couple of weeks at this particular moment, I don't know how many, is going to explain the difference between the Shofar and the Shofar Gadol, which is associated with Mashiach Tzidkenu.